the National Prosecuting Authority has now officially filed papers appealing the conviction and sentencing of Oscar Pistorius. Let's get a bit more detail on this breaking story. I'm joined by our reporter Karyn Maughan, who's covered the story in great detail for us from the start. Karyn, so there it is, confirmed conviction and sentence being appealed here.
Yes, absolutely. We know the National Prosecuting Authority is essentially saying that they believe that Oscar Pistorius' sentence of 5 years, which is under the section of the Criminal Procedure Act that he was sentenced under, is effectively 10 months in jail, was shockingly light and inappropriate considering what he had been convicted of. In appeal processes, you need to raise points of law, so it's going to be quite interesting to see how the NPA frames that. But the most important point really is their argument around the issue of dolus eventualis, that the court misinterpreted the law around dolus eventualis, and even on Oscar Pistorius' version of events, the fact that he fired 4 shots through a locked toilet door means he must have foreseen that someone behind that door could die and must have reconciled himself with the consequences of that action. And that is really going to be the most pivotal legal point in this appeal process.
It's interesting that speaking to some of the legal analysts we have over the course of this trial, many have said this issue of dolus eventualis has plagued the courts for almost 30 years. There is no clear definition that any judge can act upon in this. Is this going to be a test case that is going to be quite important legally going forward?
I think what you've just articulated is why the NPA would feel fairly confident that they would get leave to appeal. Because there is so much debate around this issue. And we saw, manifestly in the aftermath of the judgment, huge differences in legal opinion coming out about whether the judge was right and wrong on her interpretation of culpable homicide. We know, for instance, there was a huge issue around the NPA's decision, now subsequently, or policy decision, subsequently reversed, to charge drunken drivers with murder instead of culpable homicide. And the dolus eventualis forming a basis of their decision to do that, which of course was subsequently overturned even in September with the Jub case. So there is a huge amount of debate about it. There are also circumstances, Joanne, in which the NPA has agreed to plea and sentence deals with people with similar fact cases where shots were fired through doors, 1 shot for instance, and the NPA agreed to a plea and sentence on culpable homicide. And circumstances in which cases were far more severe, like that horrendous case just a few months before Oscar Pistorius' shooting of Reeva Steenkamp, where a prosecutor essentially beat a woman half to death, thought she was dead, put a plastic bag on her face, and then argued that he couldn't have reasonably foreseen that she would suffocate from that bag and therefore should be guilty of culpable homicide, and the NPA accepted that. So clearly, this is an issue that is very, very debatable, that is something that is quite peculiar in our law. We don't see a lot of other countries having a murder conviction under the principle of dolus eventualis. And I think that's why, on an academic level, this needs to be debated. But of course, for Oscar Pistorius sitting in prison and facing, a murder conviction, which clearly was something that he manifestly was fighting against, and the possibility of even additional years in prison. I mean, you can imagine why he might take it not as an academic or legal issue, but as a deeply personal one.
Well, many are asking now that he's run out of funding, he's totally bankrupt, how he'll even be able to afford an appeal.
I think that's a big issue. I think that is an issue. I mean, as far as I understand, he spent close to 18 million rand on this case. He sold his house. The cost issue is a massive issue, and I really think it's going to be very interesting to see if he keeps the same legal team that he has been. We know that they've, that Barry Rue articulated this issue of the funding in court and made it very clear that during those pieces of evidence around his support of Reeva Steenkamp's family, that he was in a very dire financial situation. Also, interestingly enough, in most of these leave to appeal instances, it's the accused asking for leave to appeal. So it's very much at the volition of the accused, and he or she will find his own funding. This is an instance in which the state is pushing for this, and they have their own resources. And he now needs to decide if and how he responds with no money at all. And I think that's going to be a massive concern to him and his family.
How soon could we see this case back in the courts?
I think they're going to want to get this sorted out as soon as possible. Remember, this is a leave to appeal application, so Judge Masipa essentially needs to make a decision about whether another court could have reached a different conclusion to her on the issue of judgment and on the issue of sentence. And, I think that given the amount of debate, I would be very surprised, particularly on the conviction issue. I'm not sure about the sentence, whether she would say that, no other court could come to a different decision. I would be quite surprised. It then kicks up, the judge president will then decide whether it's heard before a full bench in the High Court or it kicks up to the Supreme Court of Appeal. And that's really about the magnitude of the legal issues here. And I suspect that this will go to the appeal court in Bloemfontein.
Karyn Maughan, thank you so much for putting us in the picture. Just to remind you of the breaking news on the channel at this hour, the National Prosecuting Authority has now officially appealed Oscar Pistorius' sentencing and his conviction. More on that.